Hi everyone. In this video we'll quickly cover three details about functions. So first one is about evaluation of arguments. Remember that arguments are actually the things or the values or the objects that we pass to the function parameters when we call the function. So that's the distinction between arguments and parameters. And argument evaluation is basically the process of calculating the value for the given argument, which is there because usually the arguments passed to the functions, or not usually but most often, won't be just literals or single variables, but they will be expressions of some sort. It might be a function call itself. So if the function has multiple parameters, then we can pass multiple expressions, including function calls, at the time of calling the function. So the runtime will need to evaluate, basically execute or calculate the result of the expression for each argument, and then pass the calculated result to the function. So that's what the argument evaluation means. And one thing I want to mention about evaluation is the order. So if we have n different parameters, and so we pass n arguments when we call that function, some languages specify what the order will be of the evaluation. So let's say if we have function taking 3 parameters, some languages will say that the order of evaluation will be left to right. So the first parameter from left will be evaluated, or the result of that expression will be calculated. Then the second one from the left, and then the rightmost one. So some languages might say or will have no specified order. So you cannot really depend on that order. And in general, depending on the order is not a good idea. Ideally, you shouldn't worry about this. I mean, unless maybe there is some very, very specific constraint about the CPU or memory you can use. And then, I don't know, for some reasons might be, I cannot think of any good example now, but you might want to depend on the evaluation. Of course, if the language you're using says the evaluation order is specified. So yeah, that's it about evaluation. So just know that whatever at the time of calling a function, it's not just literals and variables you can pass, but also complex expressions, including other function calls. So the second thing I want to mention is the overloading, function overloading, and what it means is creating multiple or more than one function with the same name, which accept different types of parameters or different number of parameters. So basically the function signature differs only by the parameter list, not the return type, or the return type is optional. It can change, it can stay the same, but the name has to be the same. That's the key point of the overloading concept. So if you have the same two functions with the same name with different parameter lists, these are called overloaded functions. And the use of this is basically it's basically a convenience of having the same function doing or operating on different types of arguments or different number of arguments. For instance, let's say you have a program where you have a need to get the maximum number from two given numbers, right? The bigger number, the larger, or the greater. And also there is another very often occurring case where you need to calculate or get the largest value, greatest value from given 3 numbers. So instead of calling the function that accepts two arguments, two parameters, twice to calculate the maximum of 3 numbers, you can write another function called max again, but it accepts 3 parameters now. So you have 2 functions with name max, one accepts 2 parameters, one accepts 3, and you can have, basically this way it will be more optimal because now you call just one function to get it the max value for 3 given values instead of calling function twice. And this is maybe not a good example, but that's when you would need a function with different variable arguments. So another one might be if you want to log a message in a file, let's say, or in console, you write a program, you log something for your diagnostic information so that you can, after running the program, you can open that log file and see what was going on, what happened, if it ran the way you were expecting or not. So for logging some information, you might have different methods, right? Which one might be just accepting one plain string, which means you just provide what text to log and that's it. Another one might accept the string text and then maybe some log level, which will say, is this log message of just an information, or it's a warning, or it's an error, and so on. And then there might be more accepting more than 2 parameters. Maybe with like the after log information, you also provide some status code or something, or you want to log let's say the thread ID on which your program is running and things like that. So that's another thing where you would need the same function with different number of parameters. And another example is the parameters can be the same, our number of parameters can be the same, but the types of parameters can differ. So for instance, again, this max function, right? If you want to get the maximum of 2 numbers, the greater one, you have this max function. Let's say for integers, you have int as a result type, return type, and then max, and then 2 parameters, int a and int b. And then if you want to call, let's say you're getting some user input from somewhere, numbers, and then you don't know if these numbers are integers or they are floating point decimal numbers. So you might as well have another function with that same name max, but which takes 2 double arguments, parameters, and then returns a double. So that's another example of an overload. So now you don't care if it's 2 integers or 2 doubles, you still can call the max function, although these are 2 different functions, but your code looks exactly the same. So you just call the same function as if you call the same function. So that's what overloading is. Again, the more than one functions that differ only by the list of parameters. And third thing I want to cover is the variable number of parameters. So most of the languages allow this or give some special keyword or syntax for defining functions which can take variable number of arguments. So let's come back to that logging example, right? If you have a function, let's say you want to include variable number of items in your log message. So you can say, for instance, let's say we want to log the line numbers. Let's assume our program takes a file name as input and then processes that file. And that file is a text file. It finds some things in the file and then logs the line numbers at the end. So we want to write a function which will take input, for which the input parameters will be all the line numbers. So it can be 1, it can be 10, so we don't know. So, and this is not very practical example, just to illustrate the use of these variable arguments, variable number of arguments. So different languages, as I said, give you different syntax to define this. And here I brought some examples. For instance, Python gives you this star or asterisk args or double star keyword args for accessing all the arguments that have been passed to the function. In bash scripts, you can do $# to get the number of arguments that were passed to the function, and then $I, where I changes from 1 to whatever number. With that syntax, you can access the ith parameter or argument that was passed. So in more like higher level languages, non-scripting, like object-oriented languages, we can use this ellipsis syntax, for instance, with C++ or Java, which allows defining. Basically, you provide the type and then ellipsis and then the name, and it becomes, instead of just one parameter of that type, it becomes a list of parameters. And then there is some special syntax to access each element of that list. In C# there is this params keyword, and that does a similar thing. So this is useful in all cases where you want a variable number of arguments. So one good example would be, it's a little bit related to that log message function, but it's an existing real function which all the languages provide, or if not languages, but they are libraries that come with the languages. That's called a printf, or write some sort of function for outputting messages or formatting messages, string messages. So it usually takes one parameter of type string, which specifies the format of your message. And this format includes a lot of wildcard characters, which define basically, which are placeholders for some values that should be replaced in this format string. And then the other parameters, after this format parameter, the function takes variable number of parameters, which are basically all the values that should replace the placeholders. So that's a good example where we don't know how many arguments you will need when you call this function, and it might differ with every call. So that's a good use of this variable number of parameters. Okay, so I think this gives us enough context with what we can do with functions for now. We didn't cover a lot of things about functions which are specific to objects and classes. So when we get to classes and defining our own custom objects, we'll get into more details about functions, which are in this case called member functions or methods. So we will learn a lot more, but for now I think this is enough, and in the next video let's just go through some example problems and see how we can use functions, how we can illustrate all the things we learned about functions so far. and then we'll try to get into a more difficult problems than the previous time, so that we also have to think about how to solve these problems. It's not only how to translate the solution into a programming language, but also spend some time on like modeling the solution, like thinking about how to really think about this problem in a programming language from a programmer's perspective, basically. All right, that's it. Thank you. See you in the next one. Bye.